July 1944. The Texas sun hung heavy in the sky, pouring gold and heat across endless plains as a dusty military bus rumbled down a gravel road toward a camp surrounded by barbed wire and scrubland. Inside sat 33 German women, former members of the Wehrmacht's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the Allied advance in France. Among them was, once a logistics officer who prided herself on efficiency, discipline, and control. Now, after weeks of travel from Europe to New York and across the American heartland, she sat pressed against the bus window, staring at a landscape that seemed as foreign as another planet. The war felt distant here. No air raid sirens, no rubble, no hunger. Instead, open range, windmills turning lazily, and the surreal sight of a man on horseback cutting across the horizon, his wide-brimmed hat tilted low as he herded cattle through the dust. Blinked, thinking her eyes deceived her. Whispered beside her a former Luftwaffe communications operator. "Are those cowboys?" Almost laughed. It seemed absurd. Cowboys were myth, cinematic fantasy, the kind of thing Americans invented for entertainment, not reality. Yet here, under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth, rode men who looked exactly like the figures from Hollywood newsreels. Chaps, boots, ropes coiled at their saddles. She pressed closer to the glass, unable to look away. The bus jolted to a stop at a set of wooden gates flanked by a guard tower. A sign read, "Camp, Prisoner of War Branch Facility." The driver killed the engine and dust drifted through the open windows. A tall American sergeant stepped aboard, his uniform immaculate, his accent thick with a slow southern drawl. "Welcome to Texas, ladies. Y'all step out careful now, the ground's uneven." The German women hesitated. They had been told by Nazi propaganda to expect brutality. American camps, they were told, were little better than death sentences, filthy, cruel, and humiliating. But when stepped into the blinding sun, the sergeant surprised her further by offering his hand to help her down. "Sergeant Williams," he said, speaking slow but polite German. "You'll be processed and assigned quarters. You'll find camp runs by the book. You work, you get treated decent." Through the chain-link fencing, saw something that startled her even more. Prisoners, German men, clean, healthy, laughing. A group kicked a soccer ball across a dirt yard while others hauled hay bales under supervision. Beyond them, real cowboys worked with horses, some alongside German prisoners who seemed to be learning. "What is this place?" murmured, shading her eyes. "It looks peaceful." As they entered the gates, caught the smell of leather, hay, and dust, sense of a world utterly removed from the war. The camp wasn't barbed wire despair. It was part military base, part working ranch. The sound of cattle carried faintly on the wind. Inside the main building, an American female officer greeted them. "Captain Mary," she introduced herself in formal but fluent German. "You'll be assigned temporary quarters tonight. Tomorrow you'll begin work placements. Texas needs labor. You'll find the conditions here are fair." "Work placements?" asked, her brow furrowing. "In what kind of work?" Smiled slightly. "You'll find out soon enough. Texans take their ranching seriously." That night the women settled into a barracks that was surprisingly clean. Wooden bunks, real mattresses, windows with curtains instead of bars. Outside could hear the faint whinny of horses and the rhythmic creak of a windmill turning. It was the sound of an entirely different kind of captivity, one that didn't feel like punishment, but something stranger, almost unreal. Lying in her bunk, thought about the cowboy she had seen on horseback. In her world, soldiers fought with tanks and rifles, not lassos and saddles. Yet here she was, a German officer in Texas, surrounded by men who seemed like relics of another century. As night fell across the prairie, she whispered softly to herself, "So this is America." She expected barbed wire and cold rations. Instead, she'd arrived in a place where the stars stretched wider than imagination, and where tomorrow she would learn that, even in captivity, life could take on the rhythm of hoofbeats and dust. And as the coyotes began their distant howls beyond the fence line, wondered what kind of war this truly was. One fought not with hate, but with unexpected decency under an American sky. Dawn broke across the Texas plains in a blaze of gold and crimson. The sun rose fast, chasing the shadows away, and the air already shimmered with heat. Stepped out of the barracks and squinted toward the horizon where the camp's fences faded into the open range. Horses snorted in the corral nearby, their coats glistening as American cowboys' saddles and gear. The scene was so utterly alien that it made her forget, for a brief moment, that she was a prisoner of war. "Come on, ladies," called Sergeant Williams in his careful German. "Time to meet your new bosses." A line of prisoners climbed into the back of a flatbed truck, 12 German women, still half stunned by their situation. The truck rattled away from camp, kicking up clouds of dust as it followed a dirt road into the endless expanse of. Held onto the wooden rail, her eyes fixed on the distant figures riding horses along the fence line. After nearly an hour, they turned into a vast property marked by a weathered wooden arch, the Double H Ranch. The man waiting for them looked like he had stepped directly out of an old American painting. Sun-browned skin, broad shoulders, a battered hat, and a cigarette clinging to his lower lip. He stood beside a horse whose calm patience matched his own. "Name, Jim Henderson," he said, his voice a slow drawl that even the Germans could understand. "This here's my family's ranch. Been running cattle here since my granddaddy's time. Most of my hands are off in Europe and the Pacific, so we got ourselves a labor shortage. Guess that's where you come in." The women glanced at one another, unsure whether to laugh or protest. Finally spoke. "We are soldiers, not farmers," she said in English, her accent clipped but clear. Henderson's eyes twinkled beneath his hat brim. "Well, Miss Soldier, out here we ain't got much use for soldiers, but we got a mighty big need for folks who can learn to work cattle. Don't worry, we'll teach you." From the barn emerged several other cowboys, all dusty and sunburned, some barely older than boys, others grizzled veterans of the land. They sized up the German women with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "These are the new hands?" one asked. "They look like they never seen a horse before." Henderson chuckled. "Give 'em a week, Germans catch on fast." They were led to a bunkhouse on the edge of the property. Inside were clean cots, basic furniture, and a table stacked with folded work clothes, denim jeans, checked shirts, leather gloves, and wide-brimmed hats. The sight made several women laugh. "They expect us to dress like cowboys," whispered. "That's the uniform here," Henderson said from the doorway. "You can't rope cattle in army skirts." Look down at the clothes. They were coarse, practical, and strangely symbolic. Changing into them would mean setting aside the uniform she'd once worn with pride. But what choice did she have? She slipped into the jeans and boots, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar, and when she placed the hat on her head, the mirror reflected not a soldier, but something else. Someone untethered from the war, from ideology, from the old world entirely. "Mount up," Henderson said later that morning. The German women stared at the horses, shifting nervously. "Don't worry," he assured them. "These are gentle ones. You fall, you get back up. That's how we all learn." His first attempt to mount ended in embarrassment, a tangle of skirts, boots, and awkward laughter from both cowboys and prisoners alike. But Henderson's tone never turned cruel. "You're too stiff," he said, helping her up again. "You can't fight the horse, you gotta move with it." When she finally managed to sit upright in the saddle, the feeling was indescribable. The animal's warmth, the sway of its movement, the smell of leather and sweat, it was power and uncertainty all at once. "Good," said Henderson. "Now remember, out here the horse ain't your tool, it's your partner. You treat it right, it'll carry you through fire." For hours, they practiced riding around the corral under the watchful eyes of their instructors. Some fell, others cursed, and a few even cried from frustration. But by the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, every one of them was still trying, refusing to quit. That evening, the German women joined the cowboys for dinner in the ranch house. Plates of beans, bread, and salted beef replaced the meager rations they had known in Europe. The Americans spoke freely, teasing one another and occasionally offering words of praise. "You ladies did better than most greenhorns," said Maria, one of the ranch's few female cowhands. "We'll make cowgirls out of you yet." Ate in silence, her muscles aching, her hands blistered, but her spirit oddly alive. She had never known work like this, hard, honest, tangible. There was no ideology here, no propaganda, only survival and skill. That night, as the crickets sang and the wind brushed across the plains, wrote in her journal, "Today, I met real cowboys. They were not the crude conquerors we were taught to fear, nor the myths from American films. They are men and women bound to land, weather, and work. For the first time since the war began, I feel something I do not recognize, freedom." The next morning, her training would continue. And though she didn't yet realize it, the dusty plains of Texas were about to change her more profoundly than the war ever had. The third morning dawned hot and bright, the Texas sun already high enough to bake the ground. Dust hung in the air like powder, shimmering in the heat. Woke to the sound of roosters, the whinny of horses, and the muffled rhythm of boots on wooden floorboards. Gone were the rigid calls of military roll call and the echo of marching boots. Here, the day began with the sounds of life, the ranch coming alive. By now, muscles ached in places she didn't know existed. Riding lessons, fence repairs, feeding horses. It was brutal, physical work that demanded more of her than any inspection or supply drill she'd led in the Wehrmacht. Still, there was something liberating about the exhaustion. It was clean, earned, and untainted by fear or politics. After a quick breakfast of cornbread, eggs, and coffee that tasted like burnt tar, the women followed Jim Henderson to the main corral. Horses snorted impatiently, sensing work ahead. "All right, ladies," Henderson said, tipping his hat. "Yesterday you learned how not to fall off. Today you'll learn how to move cattle." The German women exchanged doubtful glances. "Move them?" asked. "You mean with horses?" "That's how we do it in Texas," said Maria, the seasoned cowgirl who'd taken on the task of teaching them. "Cattle don't move for orders or whistles. They move for patience and a good rider." She swung effortlessly into her saddle, her posture relaxed but commanding. Climbed onto her mare, a chestnut named Molly who had already learned her rider's hesitation. "You'll get the hang of it," Maria said kindly. "Just remember, horses read you. They feel your fear, your temper, your pride. You can't fool them." The morning sun climbed higher as they rode out toward a pasture where a herd of longhorn cattle grazed lazily. Could feel her heart race with anticipation and a hint of fear. The ground vibrated faintly as the animals shifted, their massive horns glinting like ivory spears. "Stay to the edges," Henderson instructed. "Cattle spook easy. You don't push them, you guide them. Keep your horse steady, use your legs more than your hands, and trust your instincts." At first, chaos reigned. The horses didn't respond to clumsy signals, the cattle scattered, and one German woman screamed when her mare bolted unexpectedly. Henderson galloped over and steadied the situation with effortless control, his voice calm and steady. "No harm done," he said, dismounting to comfort the frightened rider. "Out here, mistakes don't make you weak. Quitting does." By midday, the heat was relentless. Sweat streaked down her back, soaking through her borrowed shirt. Her hat shielded her eyes, but the glare was merciless. Still, something began to click. Her horse started responding to subtler cues, the shift of her weight, the pressure of her knees. Together, they began to move as one. Maria rode alongside her, pointing toward a wandering steer. "Cut him out gently," she said, angled Molly forward, heart pounding, and to her surprise, the animal responded. The steer hesitated, then turned back toward the herd. It worked. Exhaled sharply, a smile breaking across her sunburned face. "That's it," Maria shouted. "Now you're doing cowboy work." By the time they returned to the ranch house that evening, every woman was covered in dust and sweat, their faces flushed but alive. Henderson stood by the gate, watching them dismount. "You held your own out there," he said approvingly. "Most greenhorns would given up by noon." Looked around at her companions, women who had once marched in precise military formation, now laughing as they helped one another unsaddle horses and rub them down. They were learning something no training manual could teach, how to work as part of nature rather than command it. After dinner, the Cowboys and the German women gathered around a bonfire outside the bunkhouse. Someone played a harmonica, its tune slow and haunting. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, more stars than had ever seen in her life. Leaned close and whispered, "I never imagined captivity could feel like this." Nodded, staring into the flames. "Neither did I. It feels almost like freedom." Maria overheard and smiled. "Freedom doesn't always mean fences disappear," she said softly. "Sometimes it's finding peace inside the ones you can't escape." The fire crackled. Crickets sang in the tall grass. And for the first time since her capture, realized that the Americans hadn't tried to break her. They were teaching her how to rebuild. As she lay in her bunk that night, the soreness in her muscles throbbed like a drumbeat, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like transformation. She was beginning to understand something profound. Out here, under the boundless Texas sky, dignity wasn't taken or granted by uniforms, nations, or ranks. It was earned every day through work, patience, and trust. The war that had defined her life was thousands of miles away. What lay ahead was something entirely different, an unexpected chapter of rebirth, written in dust, sweat, and the quiet rhythm of hooves. By autumn of 1944, the Texas heat had softened, and the wind that swept across the plains carried the first hints of cooler air. The once awkward German prisoners had become competent ranch hands, their hands calloused, their faces tanned, and their English, though halting, growing clearer with each passing week, had changed more than most. Her stiff military posture had loosened into the easy gait of a rider, and her once clipped speech had softened under the lazy rhythm of American drawl. Each morning, she rode out with the Cowboys, the sun rising behind them as the cattle moved in shimmering waves across the open range. The sound of hooves and lowing herds replaced the mechanical hum of engines and the bark of orders she'd once known. She had found something she never expected, purpose without ideology. "Not bad for a German officer," Jim Henderson said one morning, watching guide a stray steer back toward the herd with practiced ease. He grinned, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "You handle that horse better than some of my own boys did when they started." Smiled faintly. "In Germany, they told us Americans were undisciplined," she said, half to herself. "Yet everything here runs on rhythm and cooperation, just not the kind I was trained to see." Henderson chuckled. "Discipline's overrated when you're working with nature. You can't command the weather or the cattle, you just work with them." That idea, the partnership between man, land, and animal, had become the foundation of transformation. She began to understand why the cowboy way endured, why it had outlasted mechanization and war. It wasn't about nostalgia, it was about respect. In the evenings, after the day's labor and the other women sat outside the bunkhouse, the air filled with the scent of mesquite smoke and leather. They talked of home, of cities reduced to rubble, of families lost to bombings. Yet more and more the conversations turned to their new lives. "Do you ever think of going back?" asked one night, her voice low. "To Germany when this is over?" Stared into the horizon where the sunset bled crimson over the plains. "To what?" she asked softly. "A nation in ruins, a past built on lies? No, I don't know what waits for me there, but here," she paused, glancing at the corral where horses shifted in the dim light. "Here I've found something real, honest." Their work had become part of the local rhythm. Townspeople still eyed them with suspicion at first. German soldiers, even women, were not easy to forgive. But respect began to replace resentment. The ranchers saw results: cattle properly managed, fences repaired, herds moved efficiently. During a trip into town for supplies, caught snippets of conversation from locals at a diner counter. "Those German gals work harder than most hired hands," said one old rancher. "Guess war makes folks humble," another replied. Henderson, who had brought and two others along, leaned toward her. "You hear that? Folks are not all bad either." Felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't the pride of rank or medals, it was the pride of belonging, of proving herself through effort, not ideology. One evening in late November, Henderson gathered his ranch hands, both American and German, for a meal in the main house. The dining table groaned under the weight of roasted meat, potatoes, and cornbread. Laughter filled the air as cowboys swapped stories, teasing the Germans about their accents and newfound horsemanship. "Can you believe this?" Maria laughed, raising her glass. "6 months ago, they didn't know a saddle from a plow. Now they're steers like they was born to it." Smiled, though the warmth in her chest carried a strange ache. She wasn't sure when she had stopped thinking of herself as a prisoner and started thinking of herself as something else. After dinner, Henderson walked her to the porch. The air was cool, filled with the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. "You've done good work here," he said quietly. "Better than anyone expected." "Thank you," she said. "I've learned more here than in all my years of service." He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm gonna say something you might not expect. When this war over, I'd be willing to sponsor you. You stay on here, work the ranch as a free woman. You've earned that chance." Froze, the offer struck her with the force of a physical blow. To stay, to build a life here among the people who had been her captors. It was unthinkable, and yet, somewhere deep inside, the idea stirred something like hope. I don't know what to say," she managed. "You don't have to decide now," Henderson said gently. "War's still, but think about it. You've got a place here if you want it." That night couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind rustle the grass outside, her thoughts tangled between two worlds. In one direction, Germany, shattered, ashamed, and uncertain. In the other, Texas, vast and open, offering a kind of redemption she hadn't known she needed. She closed her eyes and whispered into the dark. "Maybe freedom isn't about where you come from, but where you choose to belong." And though the war still raged across oceans, for the real battle had already begun, the one between memory and rebirth, between the past she carried and the future that waited beneath the Texas sky. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The radio crackled with rumors of surrender, and each new headline brought the inevitable closer. At camp, news traveled slowly, but whispers spread quickly. Germany was collapsing, was dead. The Reich had fallen. For the words carried a hollow echo. The empire that had shaped her youth, trained her to obey, and told her what to believe was gone. What remained was what she had built here, beneath the endless Texas sky. The morning after the news broke, rode out with Jim Henderson to check the herds grazing along the southern ridge. The air was crisp, the sky a vast, unbroken blue. The war might have been over an ocean away, but here life went on, cattle to move, fences to mend, horses to train. "You're quiet today," Henderson said, adjusting his reins. "Germany has surrendered," replied softly. "It's finished." Henderson nodded, his face unreadable. "I reckon that means you're free now." The word lingered between them, free, exhaled slowly. "I don't know what that means anymore," she admitted. "Free to go back to a country that no longer exists, free to wander with no home to return to." He glanced at her, his weathered features softened by empathy. "Or free to stay," he said simply. The rest of the ride passed in silence, except for the rhythmic creak of saddles and the distant lowing of cattle. When they returned to the ranch house, Henderson dismounted and turned to her. "The offer still stands. Stay here. Work for me. You've earned it." That night, under the soft glow of kerosene lamps, gathered with the other German women in the bunkhouse. Each faced the same decision. Some planned to return home, desperate to find surviving family or rebuild what little remained. Others, were torn between duty and a new life that had taken root in this strange, generous land. Said, breaking the silence, "If you could stay, would you?" Nodded slowly. "Yes, I've learned more about myself here than I ever did in Germany. Here, we are judged by our work, not our past." The words settled over them like a blessing. Weeks later, official orders came. Prisoners who wished to return home would be repatriated through New York. Those who had received sponsorship offers from American families could apply for residence. His name was among them. Henderson had already filed the paperwork. When she stepped into his office to thank him, he smiled gently. "Don't thank me. You earned it. You worked harder than most folks born here." "I never expected kindness from my captors," said. "You showed me more than kindness. You showed me trust." He tipped his hat. "That's how we do things out here. Folks earn their place by proving who they are, not who they were." By summer, his application had been approved. She was no longer a prisoner, but a free worker, a legal resident of the United States. The first thing she did as a free woman was saddle her horse and ride alone into the open plains. The land stretched endlessly before her, shimmering in the heat. Wind rippled through the grass, carrying the scent of mesquite and earth. For the first time, she realized she wasn't running from anything, not from shame, not from memory, not from war. She was riding toward something new. Years passed. By 1948, had married John Henderson, Jim's younger son who had returned from the Pacific Campaign. Together they worked the ranch, raising cattle and eventually children. The German prisoner who had once looked out from behind barbed wire now looked out over her own land, herds moving like dark rivers across the fields. Locals began to call her the German cowgirl, though few used the name with mockery. Her skill with horses and her deep understanding of ranch life earned her respect. She taught riding to young Texans, including her own daughter, Emma, whose hair and blue eyes marked her heritage but whose accent was pure Texas. One afternoon in 1950, a reporter from the Dallas Morning News came to interview for an article about the German POWs who had stayed in America after the war. He asked, "Do you consider yourself German or American now?" Smiled thoughtfully. "I consider myself Texan," she said. "Maybe that's both, and maybe it's something new altogether." He asked what had drawn her to stay. She looked out toward the horizon where the cattle grazed under the endless sky. "Because this land doesn't care where you're from," she said. "Only whether you can do the work, respect the people, and live honestly." Her words would be printed beneath her photograph. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat, hands roughened by labor, eyes calm and steady. By the time the 1960s arrived, had become part of the very fabric of the ranching community. She served on local agricultural committees, helped train horses for neighboring farms, and hosted gatherings where old cowboys still told stories by the firelight. Few remembered she had once worn the uniform of an enemy. Fewer still cared. On her 15th anniversary in Texas, stood at the corral fence at dusk, the air filled with the low hum of cicadas. Her daughter, now a teenager, rode circles in the pen, practicing her lasso technique. Good called, "Remember, don't fight the horse, feel her rhythm." As Emma nodded and steadied her reins, smiled. The lesson echoed the first advice she'd ever received from Maria, that sunburned cowgirl who had taught her not to fight the horse, but to move with it. The same advice that had taught her how to live. She had not just learned to ride, she had learned to belong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in gold and crimson, whispered a quiet truth to herself. I came here as a prisoner. I stayed as a free woman, and in learning the ways of the cowboy, I learned the meaning of freedom. Beneath that endless sky, the German cowgirl of Texas had found something greater than survival. She had found home.